Howdy folks, we're going to be working on chapter 4 here. So we're going to look at how we can interact with that database that we created in our PHP applications. So we're going to start a new project here, PHP application. And again, don't put it in htdocs, go put it in your GitHub repository. So for me, I'm going to put it in our CIS 2454 OCC repository. And then I want it to be inside of a folder there. So then I'll call this one, how about this will be our PHP database project. And then for our project name, sure, PHP database project, we'll make that match so it has a matching folder, and we're in good shape. Then for me, I had to change the port number here in XAMPP, so I'm running on port 5080. If you didn't have to change it, no big deal here. 5080, PHP database project, and I want to copy to the htdocs folder here, PHP database project. So that way I can keep all of my files and all the NetBeans files in the Git repository, and then just copy them over to htdocs for our development testing. We'll go next, next, and finish. And now we've got a project, and we should be off to the races here. So let me zoom in a little bit here. Take that comment. I really got to edit those templates. One of these days I'll do it. So right in here now then, the first thing we're going to do to connect to our database is do a couple things here. So this is, and you know, actually we might want to do this up at the top. Probably a little bit cleaner here if we do that up at the top, PHP block. We'll do up here. New PHP block. That's not the right symbol. There we go. So we need what's known as the data source name. Data source name. Now this is a big, long, ugly string here, but what it has is it tells PHP what type of database, where it is, and what the name of the database is here. So we're going to say the MySQL is the type of database, and then colon, host equals localhost. So we're saying, hey, connect to MySQL on the local host. So this is your own computer. So this is the version of MySQL that you have up and running here. Then the next thing we give it is a semicolon, and we say the DB name equals, and we go and give it the database name. So I think we called ours stock. Let's go double check that. We'll open up the PHP My Admin tool. Oh, I'm in the wrong screen over here. Yep, it's the stock database. Great. So database DB name is stock. Right, and that ends that data source name, right? So it's giving it the three things. It's giving it the database type, database server type, the location, right, and the database name. Okay, and then we're going to give it a username and a password. Now, this is bad, and I feel bad about it here, but we don't really have enough time to get into better practices here and all those sorts of workflows. So it feels bad, but we don't have time to show a better way. Right? You don't want to put usernames and passwords into source code. That's just a bad habit. But again, we don't really have time for this. And different organizations might have different tools and workflows for it anyway. So we'll just we'll feel bad about it, but we're going to do it anyway. So remember, the last thing we did last session was create that specific user. So if we go to user accounts, I have my stock user. So that's the username. So username here will be stock user. Then I'm going to give it a password. Nope, I don't know what that is. Password. Here, and that was just test. Again, hopefully you did something basic and easy here. Doesn't need to be anything crazy. It's only for local development work. Don't do this for production databases, those sorts of things here. We're just practicing the database side of things. Then what we do here is we're going to connect to that here. So then we'll say, hey, my database is equal to a new PDO. And PDO is a built-in part of PHP. So it's our Python PHP database object. Wow, I've got wrong things in the head. And we give it our data source name, we give it the username, and we give it the password. If all of that works, then we're able to connect to the database, and life is good. Now, bad things could happen, right? When we try and connect to the database, we could get some sort of error here or there. So a good habit to get into then is we want to put this in a try block. We'll say, hey, I'm going to try something that might cause an exception. And if it causes an exception, then we'll go and handle it. So I'm going to catch. Now, again, I'm just going to be lazy here and do an exception. We're just going to call that E here. And then if we get some sort of error, then I want to have the error message variable equal to that E. Now, we haven't really got to this syntax yet, so don't worry too much about it, but it's E dash greater than. So it's an arrow, E arrow, get message. So we're actually calling the get message function of this exception object. And don't worry too much about it. We'll get to more of this later here. And then we can echo out some sort of error, like, hey, a bad thing happened. I don't know, we'll just do a paragraph here. And here's our error. message, and then we can just give the error message here, and then end our paragraph. So if something happened wrong with the database, we'll get a message. If it didn't, right, the catch block never runs, and we can just echo out connected successfully or something we want to say. The database connection successful. And just to kind of see what's happening here. And our paragraph. Right, so we're going to try to connect to the database, and we'll catch an error and see what happens. That's just our index page. Let's give it a run, see what we get. Oh, and now we get an error message. We get access denied for user stock user to database stock. Okay, so something didn't go right with our permissions. Let's take a look and see. So we have stock user, and let's check the database level permissions for the stock database. We'll say go. Oh, I didn't give them access. I thought I did. That's weird. So they need the least amount of access possible, which is just these data level here. You don't want to give them access to messing with tables unless you really need to. But generally, the principle of least permission here is good. So we'll give them access. Right. So now stock user has access, and let's give it a try. Let's go back and refresh. Now if I refresh, I get database connection successful. Okay, looking good so far. So if I stop MySQL here and I refresh, it's going to take a second. It actually has to wait for it to time out here. We get no connection can be made because the target machine actively refused it. We tried to connect, but you didn't respond. So actively refused is like not responding, which is kind of, so ever so slightly different. We're saying, no, I don't want the connection rather than it's just a black hole. But for our purposes, it's essentially the same thing here. So if you get that, just make sure you turn your MySQL server back on and give it a refresh. We should be able to connect. Awesome. So a couple things we're going to do with that database object now is we're going to set up queries. Remember, we looked at how we could look at the data in our table. We had these CRUD operations. We could create, which was an insert. We could read, which was a select. We could update. We could delete. Right? And those are the commands we actually gave them access to: select, insert, update, and delete. So if I wanted to perform some of those operations, we would write a query. So let's go ahead and do that. So if we got connected, great. What we'll do is we'll make a query. So I'll say, hey, here's my query, and we'll set it to a string value. Now, if you don't remember the queries, that's okay. Not too big of a deal. We'll go to that stocks table here, and it says, hey, select star from stocks. Now, I'm going to recommend you don't use star. I think star is a bad habit because if something happens to the database tables, you could get more columns or less columns than you were expecting, and weird stuff will happen. So I prefer a much more explicit select, but select star will work. I think a better form, you would say select, instead of star, we'd say select symbol, comma name, comma current price, comma ID, or whatever order you want. So you're just listing out the field names here from the stocks table, and we don't need that where one thing. That's silly. We'll give it a go, and we get the same results, right? But we're explicit now here on what we're asking for. So I can put this whole query into my query variable here. We'll say, hey, I want to select symbol name, current price ID from stocks. We don't need to quote it here. No big deal. And that's our query. Right, to run the query, then we need to create a statement. So a statement uses that database object, and it says, hey, I want to prepare a query. Again, just part of this PDO thing here. There's a couple things we have to get used to. So you prepare the query, given the query string. Now, it's not exactly necessary you have a separate variable for this. If you can fit it right in here, it's just generally better form, right? It's just a little bit cleaner here. And then what we can do is we can go and execute the query. Excuse me. So we'll go and execute. So we want our statement arrow execute. And execute says, hey, go run the query. So let me add in some more notes here. This is run query, please. This is prepare the query, please. Right, given that query string, we'll go run it. Then what we get then is a result. So to get the result, we've got a couple options. You can either fetch a single row, or you can fetch all. You can get all the rows. So generally, I prefer fetch all because most of the time we're going to get back more than one row. And all that row means, right, is how many instances, how many rows do you have in this table? Here, right, where each of these is an instance of that stock, essentially. So we'll say, hey, I'm going to create a new variable here for stocks is going to equal my statement fetch, and I want fetch all here. Fetch all. Nope, set all. The type ahead didn't help. we're going to fetch all. We'll get all of them. And then what you want to do when you're done is you want to close your cursor. So closing the cursor tells the database, hey, we're done with it here, and you can go ahead and free up those resources, because it's actually going to keep all of that information somewhere in memory until we go and close it here. So fetch it all, read all that information, and then go ahead and close it. Now, I guess fetch all could be a little risky here. This might be if you have huge amounts of data, right? Because we're actually going and loading it all into memory here. So if you've got millions and millions of rows, this could be a bad thing here. But for our purposes, we're going to deal with maybe a couple dozen at most. We're perfectly fine. We can load all that in memory. Not too big of a deal here. Okay, and then to access all of that information, we're going to use a loop, because I have a collection here, right, of all of the rows, and then each row now has its own entries for all those values. So I'm going to do, down in the body here of my code, I'm going to do a little loop. So what I want to do is I want to create a table here. And again, if you're not familiar with tables, that's okay. It's just a way of laying things out. So tables have rows and columns, but they're not called columns. They're called data, which is kind of weird, but that's okay. So this is a table row for TR. And then what I'm going to do is use a table header, which is a special kind of table data here, to say this is the name. No, not a comment. So we'll do a couple of these ones here. Name. Nope, not a comment. I don't know why I want to do that. So name, symbol, current price, and the ID. Okay, so this is the special row. This is the header information here. Then we're going to do our loop then. So in a PHP code block, we can do two ways. So I'm going to show you the more preferred way. It's a little cleaner here than the other method. So, but you can do both. So this is a for each loop here. We'll say for each. Now we give it the collection first. So this is going to be my stocks, and then we say as. So for each one of those stocks, what do we want to call it? Individual row here. I'll just say stock. Now instead of a curly brace here, I'm going to use a colon here and end my PHP code block. Later on, I can start another PHP code block, and I will say end for each semicolon. The syntax is kind of crazy. Don't worry too much about it here, but this is the cleaner approach. You can technically do the same thing with a curly brace, opening curly brace, and an ending curly brace here. But the problem is it can be a little hard to match those up and a little bit uglier. So the colon and the end for each are the special syntax for, okay, I know this is ending that for each loop here. It's just a little more verbose there. Then what we're going to do is we're going to start a table row, right? So a new row for every stock. Then in each one of those, then I need a table data, right? Table data is like the column here. And what do I want in here? Well, I want to do a PHP echo, and I want to echo out the stock here. And then we're going to use this square brace notation. So square brace notation is generally for indexes and arrays, but we can also use named columns. So you technically can use indexes, but I'm going to, again, not recommend it here. It might work because our query is very specific, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Right? We know what values we'd get here with those 0, 1, 2, and 3. But it's just a little harder to see inside your code. So it's probably a little better here, a little more preferred to use the named indexes. So I'll say stocks index of symbol here. And then I'll end that echo. And then we end the table data. So we have a table data that will echo out that stock symbol here. Now we can put a semicolon if we wanted. And we're going to do 4 of those. Right? We'll have symbol, we'll have name, and now this needs to match the columns from your database. So remember the name of our columns here, symbol, name, current price, and ID. Those need to match what I'm putting in here for these named indexes here. This is current price and ID. So the most common issue you folks are going to run into is misnaming these or typoing these here, and they're not going to line up quite right. And that's all we do. So we make a row for each one, and each one gets that data in it, and then we end the table. So it just makes a pretty looking view of it here. Again, the table is not necessary, but it gives you a nicer looking output here. And we can see the name. So this is the header row automatically bolded that we put in, and then we get one row for each one of these that we have. And then you can do other things with tables. You can add borders and other sorts of things here. It's, however you want to do that, it's nice and pretty. But that's the basic select and viewing of these in a table. All right, folks, I'll see you in the next video.